The wind howled through the trees like a whisper from something older than time itself. Pine needles carpeted the forest floor in deep green, and somewhere beyond the tree line, hooves struck the earth with a thunder that echoed through the valley. Sarah. Blake knew that sound like her own breath. She stood on the porch of her old wooden cabin, mug of black coffee in hand, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon beyond the fence line. It was just past dawn. Mist curled around the hooves of the mustangs as they moved like ghosts through the fog, strong, free, untamed. Then she saw it. Movement. Not hooves, not wild, not right. She set the mug down without breaking her gaze and grabbed her binoculars. There, at the edge of the clearing, a flash of color that didn't belong to the forest, pink, faded, torn like fabric. Like a child's jacket, her stomach dropped. Without a word, she whistled low, sharp. Diesel, her old blue heeler, shot up from his nap and followed as she took off into the trees. 15 minutes later, her boots crunched through damp leaves and moss, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The closer she got, the louder the wind seemed to howl until she stopped cold. Tied to the base of an old pine tree, wrapped in duct tape and rope, was a little girl, no older than 7, blonde hair tangled with leaves, eyes wide open, silent, alive. Sarah fell to her knees, hands shaking as she reached forward slowly. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now, you're safe." The girl didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't move, except for a slight flinch when Sarah touched her. Arm Diesel growled low, ears pinned back. Sarah looked around quickly. No one. Nothing but forest. Who the hell would do something like this? She cut the tape carefully, murmuring calm words as the girl stared blankly ahead, her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but had forgotten how. And just like that, the world had changed. Deputy Grant showed up 20 minutes later, lights flashing, siren silent. He was a sturdy man in his 50s, face lined from Wyoming sun and years of things he didn't talk about. He looked down at the girl, now wrapped in a blanket in Sarah's arms, and rubbed his jaw. "She say anything?" Sarah shook her head. Not a word. Name, no ID, no backpack, just this. She handed him a small rubber bracelet, pink, faded, with the letters EM barely visible. Grant nodded grimly. "We'll get her checked at the clinic, run her fingerprints, see if she's in any missing kids' databases." Sarah didn't like the sound of that. Something about the girl felt untethered, like no one had ever come looking. The Mustangs had been the first to notice her, their instinct sharper than most men she knew, and that in itself meant something. As the cruiser pulled away, Emily, the name Sarah gave her for now, turned to look back through the window, and for the briefest second her eyes met Sarah's. There was something there. Not just fear, not just confusion, something ancient. Like a storm held behind glass. Hundreds of miles away in a Manhattan skyscraper, Jake Lawson stood at a floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain slick the glass like oil. He didn't know it yet, but the little girl in the woods had just cracked open a door he'd kept locked for 20 years, a door he swore he'd never open again. Behind him, an assistant rattled off his schedule, meetings, investor calls, a boardroom full of people expecting miracles. Jake turned, smiled his signature CEO smile, and nodded, but in his gut, deep down where the world didn't reach, something shifted. He wouldn't see the news until later. Wouldn't feel the weight until the name Emily found its way onto a piece of paper in front of him. And by then, it would be too late. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The sound of shoes against polished marble echoed like a metronome through the towering lobby of Lawson Global Holdings, floor-to-ceiling glass, metal, sharp angles. Clean lines. Everything about the place screamed control. Jake Lawson moved through it like a ghost in his own machine. He was dressed in an immaculate tailored suit, crisp white shirt, navy tie. The only thing slightly out of place was the look in his eyes, distant, calculating, as if even his memories were things to negotiate with. His office was on the top floor. Private elevator, restricted access, the kind of space where empires were built and dismantled over bourbon and spreadsheets. He stepped inside, nodded once to Claire, his assistant, who was already rattling off numbers. "You've got Bloomberg. At 10, merger call at 11, and Charles from legal wants 5 minutes. Jake walked past her without missing a beat. "Tell Charles he can have 4, unless someone's bleeding." Claire didn't flinch. "Also, this just came in." She handed him a tablet. Something trending, Wyoming, a girl. Jake took it without much interest until he saw the headline. "Unidentified child found bound in forest. Police seek leads." He paused. The photo was grainy, zoomed in. A little girl wrapped in a grey blanket, being carried into an ambulance. Blonde hair, pale. Her face turned away from the camera, but something in her profile stopped him cold. He zoomed in. Could have been any kid, really, but still. He stared at the screen longer than he meant to. "Where exactly in Wyoming?" he asked without looking up. Claire blinked. Campbell County, I think. Some remote area north of Gillette." "Why?" Jake didn't answer. Just handed the tablet back and turned toward the window. The rain was coming down harder now. Manhattan faded behind streaks of gray. It had been 20 years since he'd been back. Since the accident. Since the horses. Since his father. He closed his eyes. And for the briefest moment he was 17 again. Dirt road saddlebag. The sound of hooves and that final scream. The way the silence came after like a dam crashing shut. He hadn't thought about that day in a long time. Didn't want to. But now something was crawling back up through the cracks. A child. A forest. Wyoming. And his gut was telling him, no, warning him, that this wasn't a coincidence. He turned to Claire. "Cancel the 10 o'clock and move the merger call to the afternoon." "You're rescheduling Bloomberg?" "Just do it." Claire raised an eyebrow but nodded. She'd worked for him long enough to know when not to ask questions. Jake sat at his desk and opened his laptop. Not to check on quarterly earnings, not to review the board meeting notes. He typed in one word, Emily. Nothing useful came up, just articles about the girl in the woods, no last name, no background, no one had claimed her, which meant she was invisible, or someone wanted her that way. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. This wasn't his problem, but that strange tug in his chest said otherwise. He told himself it was just a coincidence. He'd seen hundreds of faces that reminded him of people he used to know. Trauma played tricks, so did guilt. But still. He clicked on the article again. That name. Emily. It gnawed at something buried deep. Back in Wyoming, his mother had once told him something strange about names, that sometimes you didn't choose them, sometimes they chose you. He hadn't believed her then. He wasn't sure he believed her now. But a voice, one he didn't want to remember, echoed in his mind anyway. "You can't outrun blood, son." No matter how far you go, he shook it off, or tried to. A knock at the door pulled him out of it. Claire again. "There's something else. The media's digging into old acquisition records. A couple of watchdogs are trying to connect the girl to an old holding. A shell company you absorbed back in 2017. Some NGOs stirring the pot." Jake's jaw tightened. What company? Westbridge Logistics. He closed his eyes. That name he did remember. A messy merger. Lots of red tape. Something about real estate, transport routes, third-party contractors. He hadn't looked at the fine print. Hadn't needed to. But now? "I want every file on Westbridge," he said. "Every contractor, every sub-company, everything they touched. I want it on my desk by noon." Claire nodded and disappeared like smoke. Jake sat back, his reflection in the glass merging with the skyline. Somewhere far out in the hills of Wyoming, a little girl was probably staring up at the ceiling of a hospital room, alone, terrified, forgotten, just like he had been. Only this time, maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe this time he could do something about it, even if it meant unlocking a door he never wanted to open again. Sarah stood in the doorway of the old barn, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The morning sun spilled through the open loft windows, casting long golden stripes across the floor. Dust hung in the air, dancing in the light like tiny ghosts. Emily sat on a pile of hay, her knees tucked to her chest, watching the mustangs through the slats in the wall. She hadn't said a word since Sarah found her. 3 days, and not even a whisper. She moved like a shadow, ate only when prompted, slept, curled up in a tight ball, under thick quilts Sarah had dragged from the linen closet. There were no tears, no screams, just silence. Heavy, echoing silence. Sarah had dealt with trauma before. She'd seen it up close. In the mirror, in the faces of neighbors who'd buried children, in the empty crib that had once sat in the room she never opened anymore. But this was different. Emily didn't cry. She didn't ask for her parents. She didn't even flinch when strangers spoke to her, except when the horses came near. That was the only time the fog lifted. Sarah had watched it happen yesterday. Diesel barked at something near the paddock, and Emily had wandered out barefoot, into the grass. One of the younger mustangs, a black mare with a white star between her eyes, approached her slowly. Emily reached out a hand. The horse lowered its head. They stood like that for minutes, no words, no movement. Just girl and mustang, like some kind of secret pact was being made in silence. Sarah had never seen anything like it. Now she watched, as Emily reached through the slats of the barn and dropped a piece of apple into the dirt. The same mare wandered over, nibbled it up, and gave a soft huff of approval. "You like the horses, huh?" Sarah asked gently. Emily didn't respond, just kept her eyes on the animal. Sarah stepped closer, squatting down so they were eye level. "You remind me of someone," she said softly. "My daughter. Her name was Lily. Still nothing. She liked horses too. Said they listened better than people." Emily's eyes flicked toward her for just a second, the briefest moment of connection. Then she looked away again. Sarah sighed and sat beside her in the hay. "You don't have to talk, not until you're ready. But you're safe here, okay? I promise." Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere down the trail, a sheriff's cruiser pulled into the gravel drive. Diesel barked once, then laid back down. He already knew who it was. Deputy Grant stepped out, removing his sunglasses as he walked toward the barn. Sarah stood to meet him. "You look like hell," she said without emotion. He gave her a tired half-smile. "Right back at you," she nodded, toward Emily. Still nothing. Grant lowered his voice. "No ID, no fingerprints in the system. Nothing in the National Missing Children's database." "It's like she doesn't exist." Sarah clenched her jaw. "That's impossible. We put out an Amber Alert statewide, got the news running it on a slow loop, but no one's called in yet." Sarah glanced back at the girl. "She didn't. Just wander out of the woods and tie herself to a damn tree, Grant." "I know." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "FBI sending someone tomorrow." "They're thinking human trafficking." Sarah's heart twisted. "She's just a baby," Grant nodded, "and someone didn't want her found." They stood in silence for a moment. "Something else," Grant added. "The bracelet." Sarah pulled it from her pocket, the little pink rubber band with the faded letters, M. "We had the lab look at it," he said. "There's a faint logo on the inside. Barely visible. It's from some charity event. Corporate-sponsored thing in New York, 6 years ago." Sarah frowned. "New York?" "Yeah. One of those big city fundraiser galas. No names connected yet. Just a company name. Westbridge." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "You think that means anything?" Grant shrugged. "Could be nothing. Could be everything." Sarah looked back at Emily, who was now lying on her side, watching the Mustang through the cracks in the wall again. "You gonna tell the feds about that?" "I'll let them dig. You and I both know the moment they get involved, this whole thing disappears behind red tape." Sarah didn't argue. She knew how that worked. She'd seen how quick the system swallowed the people it was supposed to protect. Grant started back toward his cruiser, but stopped. "You got a gut feeling?" Sarah looked at Emily, really looked this time. Her thin arms, the way she kept her back to the wall always, the look in her eyes like she was seeing something that wasn't there. "She's seen something," Sarah said quietly. "Something bad." Grant gave a single nod and walked away. When his cruiser disappeared down the drive, Sarah went back into the barn. Emily hadn't moved, but when Sarah sat down beside her again, the girl leaned just slightly. Just enough. For her shoulder to touch Sarah's, it wasn't much, but it was something. The storm rolled in by late afternoon, low grey clouds stretching across the horizon like a bruised sky pulling a blanket over the hills. Sarah could feel it before. She saw it, the way the air changed, the quiet that settled before the thunder. She stood at the edge of the paddock, arms resting on the top rail of the fence, watching the horses shift uneasily in the wind. The mustangs were already on edge, nostrils flared, ears twitching. Animals always knew when something was coming, and not just the weather. Behind her, the old house stood weathered and worn but solid. Built by her grandfather, repaired by her father, then abandoned after the fire. That night still came to her in flashes, red light dancing on the walls, the heat of smoke in her lungs, the sound of wood groaning as it gave way. But mostly, it was the silence that came after. Lily had been 5. 1 minute she was colouring by the fireplace, humming to herself. The next, Sarah was clawing at flames, screaming her daughter's name through a wall of smoke. The fire department said it was electrical. Said it wasn't her fault. Didn't matter. Sarah buried her child, left the ashes of that house behind, and moved out to the edge of nowhere to be alone with the only things she trusted anymore, horses and silence. But now, Emily was here, and silence didn't feel safe anymore. She turned and walked toward the barn. Emily had fallen asleep in the hay, curled up beside Diesel. The dog didn't move when Sarah came in, neither did the girl. They both just breathed, slow and steady. Sarah knelt down and adjusted the blanket over her. For a moment she allowed herself to gently brush a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. Lily had blonde hair too. The thought hit her hard. She stood up fast and stepped outside, letting the barn door swing half shut behind her. The wind picked up and carried the faint scent of rain and dirt, and something else, smoke. She spun. It wasn't real smoke, not this time, just a memory tugging at her senses. Still, her pulse quickened. The panic never really left. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number, New York area code. She hesitated, then answered. Hello? There was a pause on the other end, then a voice, low, calm, clipped. Is this Sarah Blake? Who's asking? My name's Jake Lawson. I'm looking into something that happened near your property. A child was found, Sarah's breath caught. And you are, what, press? No, A pause. I think I may know her. The wind howled through the phone line for a beat. She hasn't said a word, Sarah said flatly. You sure you've got the right girl? No, Jake admitted, but I have reason to believe she may be connected to a company I acquired a few years ago. Something's not right. Sarah didn't say anything. I'm not asking to come in with cameras or lawyers, Jake continued. I just need to see her, please. The last word didn't sound like it belonged in his mouth, but it was there, raw, hesitant. I'm not a social worker, Sarah said. I'm not her guardian. No, Jake replied, but I think you're the only person she trusts right now. Another silence stretched between them. Then Sarah said, if you come alone. No press, no entourage. I understand. She hung up without saying goodbye, then turned and looked toward the barn. Emily was still asleep. But Sarah's world, it was starting to wake up in ways she hadn't allowed in years. Back in Manhattan, Jake put down his phone and stared at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. Westbridge Logistics. The name felt dirty now, and for the first time in his life, he was starting to wonder what had been built under his name while he was busy chasing quarterly goals. He opened a locked drive and scrolled through old acquisition files. There it was, Westbridge, a buried line item under real estate holdings. But something stood out now. A contract signed with a private research and transportation subsidiary operating in rural Nevada and northern Wyoming. He clicked into it. Private facilities, limited oversight, third-party labor, off-grid locations. Jake's stomach turned. This wasn't logistics, this was something else. He picked up the phone. Claire, book a flight to Wyoming tomorrow morning. You have the capital raise meeting at 10. Cancel it. Move it. I don't care, just get me there. Another pause. You okay, Jake? He looked down at his hands, steady but cold. No, he said, but I'm working on it. That night, as the first drops of rain tapped the tin roof, Emily woke up gasping, eyes wide, chest heaving. Sarah rushed in, heart pounding, and dropped beside her. It's okay. Shh, I'm here. Emily clung to her, small fingers tightening into the fabric of Sarah's flannel shirt. No one's going to hurt you, Sarah whispered. Emily buried her face in her shoulder, and just as Sarah was about to lean back, she felt it. A single word, a whisper, muffled, barely there. Mom! It shattered Sarah's heart all over again. But it was a start. Jake Lawson sat in the private jet, watching the lights of the city disappear beneath thick clouds. Manhattan shrank into darkness as the plane ascended, leaving behind the steel and glass fortress he'd built piece by piece over the last 20 years. He should have felt relief, finally stepping away from the noise, the non-stop grind, the high-stakes meetings. Instead, he felt a chill in his chest, not fear, not yet, but something like it. Guilt, maybe. The leather seat creaked as he leaned back, staring blankly at the folder in his lap. Inside, printed reports, scanned documents, and photos. Westbridge Logistics, one of a dozen companies Lawson Global had swallowed during a massive consolidation phase 5 years ago. Back then it was about streamlining, efficiency, expansion, nothing personal, just numbers. But now, every line on those pages felt personal. He flipped through the documents again. A map of Wyoming. A red circle drawn around Campbell County. Coordinates. Then something strange, a photo of a facility, remote, nestled between tree lines. The caption read, Decommissioned Site, North Ridge Parcel D. It wasn't supposed to be in use, but then again a lot of things weren't supposed to happen. He closed the folder, let his head fall back and shut his eyes. That name, Emily. It hadn't just come out of nowhere. He remembered now it was the name they'd chosen. He and Claire years ago, before she miscarried, before they both buried the dream under silence and divorce paperwork. Claire had wanted to try again. Jake hadn't, couldn't. He was already slipping into work like a drug, safer to build things with his hands than his heart. But now, a girl with the same name had appeared in the woods like a ghost from the life he never let himself have, and something deep in him refused to believe it was random. Meanwhile, in Wyoming, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood barefoot in the kitchen, cradling a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The wind rattled the windows. The rain had turned to sleet. Every now and then, the house creaked like it remembered what it had. Lost. She looked down the hall toward the guest room, now Emily's room. The girl was sleeping, finally. Diesel curled up at the foot of her bed, tail thumping lightly in dreams. Sarah hadn't planned to keep her this long. It was supposed to be a one-night thing. Keep her warm. Keep her safe. Let the professionals handle the rest, but something about Emily wouldn't let go. It wasn't just that she was scared, it was that she was familiar. Not in looks, not exactly. But in the way she watched the world, guarded, quiet, like she was waiting for it to break again. Sarah knew that feeling too well. She had tried to bury it under work and fences and horses. But grief has a way of surviving even when you don't want it to. And now. Here was this little girl with shadows in her eyes and a horse's trust in her hands. Sarah wasn't ready to believe it was coincidence. She walked to the front window and looked out at the road. Nothing but mud and trees, but tomorrow Jake Lawson would be driving down it. She didn't know what she expected. A suit in polished shoes, a polished lie. She'd Googled him, of course, found the headlines. Self-made billionaire. Wall, Street's quiet king. The man who never loses. But she didn't care about Forbes lists. She cared about the girl asleep in the next room, and why the hell a man like him suddenly had a reason to care too. The next morning, Jake's rental car bounced down the gravel road, tires slipping slightly on the wet dirt. The GPS gave up 3 miles ago, but Sarah's directions had been clear. Third mailbox past the dead tree, left at the broken fence. He pulled up to the ranch just after 7 a.m. It looked exactly like she'd described it. Old, honest, a little bit haunted. He parked and stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. Wind cut across the field and carried the scent of pine and wet earth. The door opened before he knocked. Sarah stood in the frame, arms folded. No makeup, ponytail, eyes sharp enough to cut glass. You're early, she said. Jake gave a small nod. Couldn't sleep. Sarah looked him over. The tailored coat, the city edge under the calm. She didn't move aside. I don't know what you think you'll find here, she said, but this isn't your story to fix. Jake met her eyes. I'm not here to fix anything, I'm here to understand. A beat passed, Sarah stepped aside. Coffee's in the kitchen, don't touch the dog, he bites people who lie. Jake walked in slowly. Diesel lifted his head and growled low from the hallway. Noted, Jake said. He looked around. Wood-paneled walls, old photos, a worn couch that had clearly seen better days, and a warmth that no penthouse in Manhattan could ever replicate. She's still sleeping, Sarah said. She doesn't speak, barely eats, only comes alive around the horses. Jake nodded slowly, absorbing it all. Has she said her name? Sarah hesitated. She said one word, last night, while dreaming. Jake turned. What word? She didn't blink. Mom. That hit him harder than he expected. Sarah studied his face, not missing the flicker of pain that passed through it. You think she's yours? She asked. Jake swallowed. I don't know, that's the problem. I don't know what happened in that company, what people did with my money, my name. But if she's connected to Westbridge, then yes, she's mine. One way or another. Outside, a horse whinnied. The wind carried the sound between them like a warning. Sarah finally nodded once. I'll take you to her, but if she runs, you stop. If she cries, you leave. Understood, Jake said. And just like that, the door behind the past creaked. Open. Jake followed Sarah out to the barn in silence. The morning was quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but thick with anticipation. The kind of quiet that presses on your chest. Birds didn't sing. Even the horses seemed to move slower, more careful. Sarah pushed open the barn door and stepped aside. She's back there, she said softly. Third stall from the end. She's with Star. Jake glanced at her. The black mare? Sarah raised an eyebrow. How'd you know that? She was in the background of one of the news photos. He paused. The only thing Emily wasn't afraid of. Sarah didn't reply, just gave a curt nod and walked away. She wasn't going to hold his hand through this. Jake took a breath and stepped into the barn. The smell hit him first. Hay, sweat, wood, something earthy and raw. The kind of scent that lived in his childhood, buried deep under boardrooms and dry-cleaned suits. It pulled something loose in his chest. He walked slowly past the stalls, the soft sounds of shifting hooves and snorts echoing like whispers. Then he saw her, Emily. She was sitting on a pile of hay, knees pulled up, tiny fingers holding half an apple out to the mare. Star leaned down gently and took it from her hand, lips brushing her palm. The girl smiled, just barely, and reached up to stroke the horse's cheek. She hadn't noticed him yet. Jake stayed perfectly still. His throat tightened. There was something heartbreakingly familiar in the way she moved. Careful, like... The world had taught her not to trust it, and yet with the horse she was open, present. He stepped forward, slow. The second his foot shifted the hay, Emily froze. She didn't turn, but he could see her body go rigid. Star let out a soft huff and moved slightly in front of her, protective. Jake crouched down, keeping his voice gentle. Hey, Emily. No response. My name is Jake. I'm not here to hurt you, I promise. Still nothing. He reached slowly into his coat and pulled something out, a small folded photograph. He placed it on the floor between them and slid. It across the hay. It was worn, a little faded but clear enough. A woman, early 30s, warm smile, hair pulled back in a ponytail, and in her arms, a baby, swaddled in pink. Emily's eyes flicked to the photo. Then to him, Jake saw it, the flicker of recognition, the jolt of memory she didn't know she had. I don't know if you remember her, he said quietly. Her name was Elena. She was kind. She worked for a company I owned. And that baby in her arms, he swallowed. I think that might be you. Emily's lower lip trembled, but she didn't speak. Her fingers reached toward the photo, then pulled back. It's okay, Jake said. You can take it. Slowly, cautiously, she picked it up and stared at it. Jake didn't move, didn't push. I didn't know what they were doing, he said, voice low. But I should have. I signed the papers. I looked the other way. And if that put you in danger, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Emily blinked, then looked at him directly. Her voice was a whisper, broken and dry. She's gone. Jake's. Heart stopped. What? She pointed at the woman in the photo. She tried to stop them. They took her away. They said she wasn't my mom. Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall. But she was. Jake dropped his head, overcome Elena. He remembered her vaguely. One of the original caretakers at the Westbridge off-grid facility. She wasn't supposed to be part of anything dark. She was assigned as a medical assistant. But then, maybe she saw what was happening, maybe she tried to fight it, and maybe she paid for that. Emily clutched the photo tighter. They said I was just property, she whispered. Jake looked at her, shattered. You are not property, you're a person, you're you, and I promise you no one will ever say that to you again. For a long time Emily said nothing. Then slowly she got to her feet and walked toward him. She stopped just short of touching him, eyes searching his face. You knew her? She asked. Jake nodded. Not well, but I wish I had. Emily reached up, hesitant, and pressed the photo into his hands. Keep it, he said. It's yours. But she shook her head. She's part of your story, too. Jake took it, fighting back emotion. Thank you. Then, to his surprise, Emily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. It was quick. A child's hug. Small, tight, unsure. But it was everything. Jake didn't know how long he stood there, arms wrapped around the girl he may have accidentally helped orphan. But he knew this. The damage done by silence could only be undone with truth. And Emily had just taken the first step. Outside the barn, Sarah watched from a distance. She'd seen 1,000 people walk into this property over the years. Foster agents, doctors, do-gooders. Jake was the first one who hadn't looked at Emily like a problem to solve. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't here to run. And if he was, Sarah was ready to make damn sure he didn't get far. The next morning broke clear and cold. For the first time in days, the storm had passed, and Wyoming's wide skies stretched blue and open above the ranch. Steam curled from the coffee pot in Sarah's kitchen, while the quiet hum of morning settled across the land. Jake sat at the table, staring into his mug like it held some answer he hadn't found yet. Emily was outside. She'd woken up early, wordless again but calm. She slipped on boots 2 sizes too big and wandered out toward the pasture. Star trailed close behind her like a guardian spirit. Sarah watched from the doorway, one hand curled around her own cup. She trusts you, she said, without looking at Jake. That doesn't happen much, especially not so fast. Jake ran a hand over his face. I don't know what to do with that. Maybe don't do anything, Sarah replied. Maybe just be someone who stays. Jake looked out the window. Emily was perched on the top fence rail now, legs swinging, wind tugging at her hair. Star stood just beneath her, nuzzling, her knee every so often, as if to check she was still real. I've spent my whole life moving, Jake said, fixing things by leaving them behind. Sarah took a sip of coffee. And how's that worked out for you? He didn't answer. The silence stretched between them until Jake reached into his coat pocket and slid a folder across the table. I found this last night, from the Westbridge files. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You brought corporate paperwork to a barn. Just read it. She flipped it open. Her eyes scanned fast. Contract summaries, acquisition dates, internal memos. But one page stood out. A facility report dated 6 years ago. Location, Parcel D, North Ridge Zone. Listed occupants, 12 miners, 6 caretakers, 1 unnamed supervisor. Is this where she was? Sarah asked quietly. Possibly. Jake leaned forward. There's no record of the kids after 2019, no formal closure notice. The facility was quietly erased, scrubbed. Sarah's fingers tightened on the paper. Why? Jake hesitated. There's chatter in the internal memos, references to testing, something medical, not pharmaceuticals. Behavioral metrics. Attachment studies. Sarah looked up, alarmed. You're saying they were experimenting? I don't know. Jake's jaw clenched. I didn't know. That's the point. Sarah shook her head. Kids don't just vanish, Jake, not unless someone wants them to. Exactly, he said. And if Emily made it out, that means someone else didn't. The words sat heavy between them. After a beat, Sarah pushed the file back toward him. So what now? Jake stared out at the field. There was a man who signed the closure order, internal security. His name's buried in a Westbridge side ledger. I don't recognize it, but he operated out of Gillette, not far from here. Sarah narrowed her eyes. You want to talk to him? Jake nodded. I have to. He might know what happened to Elena, what they did to Emily, maybe even where the others are. You think there are more? Jake looked at her, steady. I think there were 12, Emily's one, that leaves 11. Sarah didn't blink. Then I'm coming with you. Jake frowned. This could get ugly. Sarah's eyes were cold steel. You think I haven't seen ugly? That girl sleeps in my house. You think I'm letting you chase this alone and risk losing her again? Jake considered that, then gave the faintest smile. Fair enough. They stood, grabbed coats, and walked out to the truck. Emily looked up from the fence as they approached. Hey, Sarah called gently. We need to go into town. Won't be long. Diesel's gonna stay. Here with you. Emily glanced at Jake, then to Sarah. She didn't speak, just nodded once and slid off the fence. Jake leaned down. We'll be back soon, okay? Emily hesitated, then reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a single smooth river stone. She placed it in his palm. Jake looked at it, confused. What's this? Emily's voice was barely a whisper. Trail marker. Jake met her eyes, throat tight. To find our way back? She nodded. Sarah watched the exchange, something soft flickering in her guarded expression. Let's go, she said quietly. The road into Gillette was long and winding, the kind of drive where time seemed to stretch out into forever. Snow still clung to the shoulders of the road, melting slow in the pale sunlight. Jake drove while Sarah scanned through the files on her lap, lips pressed tight. You sure this is the right place? She asked, pointing to a highlighted address. It looks like some kind of repair shop. Jake nodded. Front business called Iron Ridge Equipment, but the guy who signed off the closure order, Kenneth Trask, owns it, and he hasn't worked for Westbridge in 5 years. Sarah looked out the window, her fingers tapping restlessly against the file. People don't just walk away from things like that, she murmured. No, Jake agreed. They bury them. The shop looked unremarkable. Faded sign, grease-streaked garage doors, a couple of rusting trucks out front. One of them still had Westbridge tags. Jake parked down the block. Let me go in first, he said. Sarah didn't argue. Inside, the shop smelled like oil and dust and burnt coffee. A country radio station played low in the background. Behind the counter stood a thick-set man with a grey beard and tired eyes. He looked up as Jake stepped in. Help you? Jake walked slowly to the counter. You Kenneth Trask? The man's expression changed. Not surprise. Something colder. Recognition. Who's asking? Jake slid a photo across the counter. Elena holding baby Emily. Trask didn't touch it, but his jaw twitched. Get out. Jake didn't move. What happened at Parcel D? Trask leaned in. You don't want to know. Walk away, city boy. But Jake didn't flinch. Behind him, the door creaked open again. Sarah stepped inside, quiet as a shadow. Trask's eyes flicked to her, then back to Jake. You don't know what you're poking at. Jake's voice dropped. No, but I know you signed the order, and I know a little girl almost died because of it. Something shifted in Trask's eyes. Fear, maybe. Regret? Then he said 3 words that changed everything. They're still alive. Sarah froze. Jake's breath caught. They're still alive? Jake repeated, voice low, tense. The others? Where? Kenneth Trask didn't look like a man used to guilt, but now it was leaking through the cracks in his face. He shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, glanced toward the shop door like he might bolt. Some of them, he muttered. Not all, not anymore. Jake stepped closer. Tell us everything. Trask looked at Sarah. Her eyes were locked on his like a hawk sizing up a wounded animal. She didn't blink. Trask ran a hand down his face, then pulled a chair out from behind the counter and sat down hard. The legs groaned under the weight of something more than just his body. It was supposed to be temporary, he said. Back in 2017, Westbridge signed a contract with a defense subcontractor. Low-profile behavioral testing, nothing above board. No federal eyes, they needed kids. Jake's stomach churned. Needed? Orphans. Wards of the system. No next of kin, no one who'd come looking. They were picked through data lists, then funneled into state-run foster centers in places no one paid attention to. Nevada, Utah, South Dakota. Then redirected. Sarah clenched her fists. Redirected to where? Trask hesitated. Parcel D was one, there were others, all in isolated areas. They built stories around each location. Logistical fronts, mining permits, even environmental research. Meanwhile, the kids were used as lab rats for social resilience trials. Jake's voice was like ice. And what does that mean? Trask looked sick. They ran simulations, trauma response environments, isolation, reintroduction, trigger testing. The idea was to see how far you could push a child before they broke, and how fast they could recover with the right behavioral conditioning. Sarah stepped forward. Emily, was she in that program? Trask nodded once, slowly. She was one of the last. The final control group. Younger than the others. Different treatment. They brought in Elena to monitor her. Elena wasn't like the rest of us. She had a conscience. That's what got her killed. Sarah felt the world tilt. You were there. Trask flinched, but didn't deny it. Security oversight, I wasn't supposed to ask questions, but I saw enough to know it was wrong. And when Elena started leaking reports, they shut everything down. Quiet. Cold. A few kids were reassigned. A few disappeared, and some they buried. Jake's voice cracked. Where are the survivors now? Trask looked at him for a long, heavy moment. Then he stood, walked into the back room, and returned with a battered metal lockbox. He opened it slowly and pulled out a flash drive and a folded map. This is all I kept, he said. Names, locations, coordinates. 3 confirmed kids, maybe more. They split them up. Hid them in therapeutic boarding schools and wilderness youth camps, places that don't like reporters or paperwork. He handed the drive to Jake, then turned to Sarah. I didn't know her name until now. Emily. But if she survived Parcel D, she's stronger than we ever understood. Sarah took the flash drive, then stared him down. You don't get to call her strong. You don't get to speak about her. Trask nodded. Fair. Jake folded the map carefully and looked the man dead in the eyes. If anything happens to her, if anyone comes near that ranch, I'll bury every inch of this story under your name. I believe you, Trask said quietly. Jake and Sarah turned and walked out into the cold morning. The sky had turned gray again. They didn't talk until they were halfway back to the ranch. Jake drove with one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the map so tightly his knuckles were white. Sarah sat beside him, flipping through the notes Trask had scribbled. 3 names. Kira, age 11. Last seen in Montana. Samir, age 9. Transferred to a facility in Idaho. Maya, age 12. No known location, possibly in a psychiatric hold. Jake exhaled through his teeth. We have to find them. Sarah looked out the window. Yeah, we do. But we start with Emily, Jake added. We tell her the truth. No more secrets. Sarah gave a small nod. She's not a victim. Not anymore. Jake glanced over. You ever think maybe you were supposed to find her? Sarah didn't answer at first. Then softly she said, No, I think she was supposed to find me. Back at the ranch, Emily sat in the barn with a notebook in her lap, drawing something with a broken pencil stub. Diesel lay beside her, eyes closed, tail thumping once in a while. As the truck pulled up, she looked up, cautious, not scared. She stood and walked to the gate just as Sarah and Jake stepped out. Sarah met her halfway and crouched down. Hey, sweetie, she said gently. We found someone who knew the place you came from. Emily stiffened. But that man's not going to hurt anyone ever again, Sarah said. And we found something else too. Jake knelt beside them. He pulled out the map and unfolded it slowly. There are others, Emily, he said softly. Kids like you. They're out there. Maybe scared, maybe alone, but maybe waiting for someone to come find them. Emily looked at the map, eyes wide. Her fingers traced the red ink where 3 names had been written. She didn't speak, but she reached back into her pocket and pulled out another river stone. This one was painted, rough but bright. A small, white horse. She pressed it into Jake's, and then, for the first time in a long time, she smiled. The morning after their meeting with Trask was grey, the kind of day where the sun seems to be hiding behind a blanket of clouds, too heavy to break through. Jake stood at the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee, while Sarah, still in her jacket, sat at the table, turning the map over and over, tracing her finger along the lines and coordinates. Emily was in the barn again, the rhythm of her soft voice. As she spoke to Star, the only sound in the distance, Jake had a feeling that Emily wasn't just talking to the horse, she was figuring out how to make sense of everything. The girl had gone through more than anyone should ever have to, but she still held on to that quiet strength. "Which one first?" Sarah asked, looking up from the map. Jake took a deep breath. "We start with Kira. Montana's a bit of a stretch, but it's the closest, and if we get there fast enough, we might actually find something solid." Sarah nodded, folding up the map and slipping it into her bag. She didn't need to ask why Jake had chosen Kira. He knew her type. She was the kind of person who would run into danger, not away from it. And Jake knew they'd have to move fast if they were going to keep the trail warm. "Let's go," Sarah said, standing up. The drive to Montana took longer than they expected, the roads winding through forgotten towns and dry, endless fields. There were no signs of life in most places, just houses abandoned to time and neglect. The occasional cow or horse grazed in the distance, their forms small against the horizon. Emily didn't say much in the back seat, just stared out the window as the landscape passed by, as if she were searching for something. Jake could see the curiosity in her eyes, but also something else, a quiet anxiety that he couldn't quite name. "Hey," Jake said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "You all right?" Emily gave a small nod. "Just wondering what happens next." Jake smiled, though it was a little strained. "That's a good question, but I think we're getting closer to the answer." They didn't stop until they reached a small, remote town near the edge of the mountains. The name on the welcome sign was faded and almost unreadable, but the rundown gas station and diner nearby told them all they needed to know. Not much had changed here in years. Sarah parked the truck in front of a dusty motel with a neon sign flickering above the door. It was late afternoon now, and the sky had taken on a golden hue, the light casting long shadows on the ground. "This is where we start," Sarah said, checking her phone for the latest update. "The facility where Kira was last seen was about 30 minutes from here. It was supposed to be a behavioral rehab center, but I think it was just a cover." Jake's eyes narrowed. "So we're going in blind, no guarantees we find anything useful." "That's the plan." Sarah glanced at Emily in the rearview mirror. "You okay with this, Em?" Emily looked out the window at the mountains in the distance. Then, without turning to face them, she said, "I think I'm ready." Jake caught Sarah's eyes for a moment. It was clear they were both thinking the same thing. She's been ready all along. The drive to the facility was more treacherous than they anticipated, the road narrowing into a rocky path as they got closer. The sign marking the entrance was rusted and bent, barely visible in the fading light. Sarah slowed the truck, her eyes scanning the landscape as they approached the gate. The facility looked abandoned. No movement, no sounds, except the wind. The tall fences surrounding the property were starting to crumble, and the main building loomed in the distance, like a dark, forgotten monument. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here in years," Jake said, his voice low. Sarah parked the truck and they all piled out, Emily staying close to Sarah's side as they approached the gate. It was locked, but the gate itself looked fragile, like it could be pried open easily enough. "We're not here to make noise," Sarah whispered, her eyes sharp. "Stay quiet, we move fast." Jake nodded, motioning for Emily to stay behind him as they slipped through the gap in the gate. The overgrown path led them to the back of the facility, where the walls were stained with mildew and the windows were boarded up. "Let's check the office first," Sarah suggested, her voice barely a murmur. "If they kept records, it'll be there." The building was eerily silent as they moved inside, the floor creaking beneath their boots. Dust motes floated in the dim light, and the faint scent of mildew clung to the air. The hallway stretched in front of them, empty rooms on either side. They came to a locked door marked Admin. Jake tried the handle. It was stuck. He glanced at Sarah. "We need a key." Sarah pulled a small flat crowbar from her bag and handed it to Jake. He worked it into the door frame, gently prying it open. The door creaked and groaned, but it finally gave way. Inside, the office was a mess, papers scattered across the desk, a filing cabinet half open. There were old computer monitors covered in dust, their screens dark. It looked like the place had been abandoned in haste. "This is it," Sarah said, flipping through some of the papers. "Old patient records, incident reports. If Kira was here, there's a good chance we'll find something." Jake's eyes scanned the papers. There were names, dates, times, random notes about behavior patterns and psychological assessments, but nothing that stood out. Not until he reached the back of the filing cabinet, a folder with Kira's name. He pulled it out and opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph of Kira, a girl about Emily's age, with long brown hair and wide, curious eyes. There was a date on the back. Just a few weeks before the facility had been shut down. Kira had been one of the last to leave before everything went dark. Jake studied the notes carefully. There were references to treatment, but it didn't seem medical. It was a series of notes about progress, adaptation, and even conformity. "We're looking at another testing center," Jake muttered. Sarah nodded grimly. "Just like Parcel D, just like the rest." Emily stepped forward and looked at the picture of Kira. She hesitated for a long moment, her fingers brushing the edges. "Of the paper. They did this to us," Emily said quietly. "But they can't do it anymore." Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, they can't." Sarah slammed the folder shut. "Let's go find Kira. She's the first step." They left the building quickly, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. They still had a long road ahead, but now at least they knew who they were looking for. And that was enough. As they drove away, Emily held onto her riverstone, staring out the window, her face set with determination. She hadn't said a word since they left the facility, but Jake could feel the change in her. She was ready. The hunt had begun. The sun had barely begun to rise the next morning, casting a faint golden glow over the quiet town. The cool air carried the scent of pine and distant rainfall, a stark contrast to the tension still hanging thick in the truck. Jake gripped the wheel as they made their way back down the dirt road, the map still open on his lap. The file from Kira's case was tucked into his bag, a weight he could feel pressing down on him more with every mile. "Next stop?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but Jake could tell her mind was racing, just like his. "Idaho," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "We'll follow the trail from Kira to Samir. If he's still in one of those camps, we need to find out which one before anyone else does." Emily was sitting quietly in the back seat, her eyes half closed, lost in thought. She hadn't said much since they'd left the old facility, her gaze distant. Jake knew she was still processing everything they'd learned, and he wasn't sure if she was ready to fully confront the truth just yet. But there was no time to waste. They had to keep moving forward. "Do you think we'll find him?" Sarah asked quietly, almost to herself. Jake exhaled through his teeth. "I'm not sure, but I won't stop looking until we do." The air inside the truck was thick with the unsaid, the weight of the past few days pressing in on them. There was a strange quiet between them now, not the comfortable kind that came from shared experience, but something heavier, more urgent. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about finding Emily anymore. It was about finding the others, about exposing the truth that had been buried for so long. As they neared the outskirts of the town, the phone in Jake's pocket buzzed, cutting through the silence. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, her eyes on him for a moment. Jake pulled the phone out and glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. His first instinct was to ignore it, but something in his gut told him it might be important. He answered it. "Hello?" Jake's voice was low, cautious. "Mr. Walker?" The voice on the other end was sharp, professional, and unmistakably familiar. "Trask," Jake said, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "Yeah, it's Kenneth. "I've got a lead on Samir," Trask said quickly. "You need to listen carefully. There's a camp, a private one, up near the border just outside of Boise. They're calling it a rehab center, but it's nothing like that. It's one of the last places I know of where they kept kids for these experiments." Jake's heart started pounding in his chest. He glanced at Sarah. She was already focused, eyes narrowed as she turned to look at him. "Where exactly?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll send you the coordinates," Trask replied. "But you need to move fast. There's a chance. Samir is still there, and if he is, well, you'll need to act before anyone else does." Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. "Thanks. We'll be there." Trask hesitated before continuing. "One more thing, Mr. Walker. This place, it's not just a camp. It's a holding facility. They've been using it for much more than they let on. They've got more people there. People who don't want to be found. Don't trust anyone around there." Jake's stomach twisted. "Got it. We'll handle it." Without another word, the line went dead. Jake set the phone down, his mind racing. "Is it Samir?" Sarah asked, her voice urgent. "Yeah," Jake answered, his fingers gripping the map tightly. "We're heading to Boise. Trask gave us coordinates for a camp. Near the border. We need to move fast before anyone else gets to him first." Emily looked up from her window, her expression unreadable. "Will we find him?" "We'll find him," Jake said, his voice firm, more to himself than anyone else. "And we'll get him out." The tension in the truck thickened as they drove, the quiet. Hum of the engine the only sound. The further they got from the town, the more isolated the surroundings became. Sparse trees lined the roads, and the landscape flattened out as they neared the foothills of the mountains. Sarah's phone buzzed, and she quickly checked the message from Trask. The coordinates were marked clearly, the location in the middle. Far of nowhere, far from any major towns or roads. "This place is way off the grid," Sarah said, her brow furrowing. "It's going to be tough to get in unnoticed." "We don't have a choice," Jake replied. "We go in, get Samir, and get out fast." Emily stared out the window again, her fingers clenching the river stone she always carried with her. Jake glanced back at her in the rearview mirror. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Emily didn't respond right away, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not scared anymore," she said. "I'm ready to fight." Jake met her eyes in the mirror, a mixture of pride and something else he couldn't name welling up inside him. She wasn't the scared little girl who had first shown up at the ranch anymore. She was something else entirely, someone who had already been through hell and wasn't afraid to walk through it again. "Good," he said softly, "because we're all in this together." The drive to the camp took several more hours. As they neared Boise, the landscape shifted again, the rugged terrain becoming more mountainous and isolated. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the first hints of rain began to fall. They followed the coordinates Trask had given them, navigating through a series of winding back roads that led them further away from civilization. Finally, they reached a small, overgrown path that seemed to lead directly into the mountains. "This is it," Sarah said, stopping the truck. "We need to be careful from here on out." Jake nodded, looking at Emily. "Stay close, okay?" Emily didn't say anything, but she nodded, gripping the stone tightly in her hand. They climbed out of the truck and began to walk, the wet earth squishing beneath their boots. The air was thick with moisture, and the quiet around them was almost oppressive. The camp wasn't far, just up a small incline hidden behind thick trees and brush. As they crept closer, they could see the outlines of old buildings in the distance. It was a facility, a sprawling compound surrounded by high fences. There were no signs of life at first, but something about the place felt off, as if it were waiting for something or someone to return. "Let's go," Jake whispered, motioning for Sarah and Emily to follow him. They moved in silence, the rustling of leaves the only sound as they approached the compound. It was time to find Samir, and they weren't leaving without him. The darkness of the forest seemed to press in on them as they moved through the trees. The air was thick with the scent of rain and earth, and the ground was slippery underfoot, making every step feel like a risk. Jake kept his eyes trained ahead, his mind running through the next steps, the potential dangers, the exit strategies. Everything had to be perfect. As they neared the compound, the high fences surrounding it became clearer. They were rusted in places with barbed wire at the top, but there were no guards, no movement. It seemed abandoned, but Jake wasn't convinced. There was something off about the place, something that didn't sit right. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, scanning the perimeter. "It's too quiet, they're expecting us." Jake didn't reply at first, his hand resting on the cold metal of the fence. "I'm not sure yet, but we need to get in without being noticed." They huddled together behind a thicket of trees, the shadows of the night stretching long. The compound loomed ahead, the faint glow of a few distant lights flickering in the dark. "Can you see a way in?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded slowly. "There's a gap in the fence up ahead. Looks like it's been cut, we can squeeze through." Emily, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up from behind them. "What if they've set traps?" Jake turned, meeting her eyes in the dim light. "If there are traps, we'll avoid them. We've been through worse, remember?" She gave a small nod, though there was a lingering worry in her eyes. Jake could see it, that same unease that had been with her since they'd left the ranch. She was still processing everything, still carrying the weight of what had happened to her and the others. But she was tougher than she knew, tougher than he had ever expected. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice firm. "We move fast. Get in, get Samir, and get out." They slipped through the gap in the fence, their movements careful and deliberate. The compound was large, much larger than Jake had anticipated. Several buildings were scattered across the property, most of them dark and seemingly empty. But something about the place felt wrong, like a buried secret was waiting to be uncovered. They crept forward, using the cover of the trees and shadows to stay out of sight. Every sound felt amplified in the silence of the night. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant rustle of the wind, the occasional creak of metal from the abandoned structures. The place seemed like a ghost town, but Jake knew better than to trust appearances. "This way," Jake whispered, pointing toward a cluster of buildings near the center of the compound. It was there that Trask's information had pointed them, where Samir might be held. They moved swiftly but cautiously, never staying in one spot for too long. As they approached the first building, Jake noticed a faint light coming from a small window. It wasn't bright, just a dull glow. But it was enough to make Jake pause. He motioned for Sarah and Emily to stop, and they huddled in the shadows, waiting. "We're close," Sarah murmured. "Too close. We need to be careful." Jake nodded, but didn't speak. His mind was already racing, running through the possibilities of what they might find inside. He had to stay focused. The last thing he wanted was to walk into a trap. They moved closer to the building, their steps muffled by the thick grass and underbrush. As they reached the window, Jake crouched down and peeked through the glass. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside there were several people. None of them looked like guards. They were young, disoriented, sitting on the floor, their eyes vacant. They looked like they were in some kind of trance. But it wasn't the people that sent a chill down Jake's spine. It was the man standing in the corner of the room, a tall figure, dark-haired and wearing a white lab coat. The man was scribbling notes in a notebook, his back to the window. Jake's pulse quickened as he recognized him. Dr. Reed. He was one of the doctors who had been involved in the testing programs. Jake remembered his name from the files they'd uncovered. Dr. Reed had been involved in the psychological experiments that had been done on the kids. It was him. He was the one who had been conducting the tests, the one responsible for so many lives ruined. "That's him," Jake muttered under his breath, pointing at the figure inside the building. "That's the bastard who did this to all of them." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What is he doing here?" "He's the key," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "We need to get to him. He knows where Samir is." They didn't have much time. Jake glanced around, looking for another way inside. He could hear the soft murmurs of the kids in the room, their voices faint but filled with a sense of hopelessness. They needed to move fast before anyone noticed them. "I'll go in," Jake whispered. "I'll talk to him." "No," Sarah said sharply. "We can't let him see you. He's dangerous." "She's right," Emily added, her voice calm but insistent. "He might recognize you. You're the one who got away." Jake's stomach tightened at the thought. He knew she was right. Dr. Reed would remember him. He had been one of the test subjects too, but he had escaped. They had all assumed he was dead. And now, seeing him standing in front of those kids, Jake's mind raced with anger and fear. "I'll draw him out," Jake said, making a decision. "Sarah, you and Emily get inside. Get the kids out. I'll handle Reed." Before Sarah could argue, Jake was already moving. He slipped around the side of the building, his heart pounding in his chest. There was a side door. It was unlocked as if they had been expecting him. He pushed it open, stepping inside carefully. The room was cold and sterile, the walls lined with old equipment, the flickering light casting long shadows across the floor. Dr. Reed was still at the desk, his back to Jake, scribbling notes with a mechanical, rhythmic motion. Jake's hand clenched into a fist as he stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You're not going to get away with this." Dr. Reed froze, his pen still in his hand. Slowly he turned to face Jake, a small, almost amused smile curling at the corner of his lips. "I wondered when you would show up," he said coolly. "Did you think you could just walk away from this, Walker?" Jake didn't answer. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Reed's. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say yet. Anger, fear, and a desire for justice all swirled inside him. But he knew one thing for sure. Reed wasn't getting away this time. "Where's Sam here?" Jake demanded, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Dr. Reed's smile faded. He stood up, his posture relaxed, like he wasn't afraid. "Samir, you really think you can just walk in here and take him? You don't even know what you're dealing with." Jake's jaw tightened. "I'll make you tell me." Just then a loud crash echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of footsteps. "Get down!" Jake shouted, instinctively diving to the floor. As the door burst open, 2 guards rushed in, guns raised. But Jake wasn't going down without a fight. The sudden burst of gunfire echoed in Jake's ears as the guards stormed into the room. They weren't wasting any time. The cold metal of the guns glinted in the dim light, and for a brief moment Jake's heart skipped a beat. The situation had escalated quickly. He scrambled for cover, sliding behind an old filing cabinet just as the guards opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Jake's mind raced. He had to stay calm. The last thing he needed was to panic now. There was a way out. There always was. "Sarah! Emily!" Jake shouted into the radio attached to his belt, hoping they were close enough to hear him. "Get the kids. I'll handle these 2. He heard the faint crackle of static, but no response. His heart clenched. Were they already inside? Were they safe? There was no time to think about it. The guards were closing in. One of them was taking cover behind a desk, while the other advanced toward Jake's position. Jake gripped his gun tightly, his fingers steady as he calculated his next move. He had the element of surprise on his side. The guards had no idea. Where he was, not yet. Taking a deep breath, Jake moved, fast and fluid, pushing off from his crouch. He fired once, hitting the guard in the chest. The man staggered back, his weapon slipping from his hands, and fell to the ground with a heavy thud. The other guard spun toward the sound of the shot, but Jake was already moving again. He dove toward another stack of crates just as the second guard opened fire, his bullets punching holes in the crates. Jake's pulse raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he didn't stop. He fired again, twice, and the second guard went down with a grunt. The room went silent. Jake didn't allow himself to relax. His eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner. He could hear the faint sound of movement from the hallway. More guards were coming. He needed to move quickly. His gaze flicked to the door where Dr. Reed had been standing moments before, but now the man was gone. Jake's stomach dropped. Reed had slipped away during the chaos. He cursed under his breath. He couldn't afford to lose him now. He grabbed the radio again, his voice urgent. "Sarah, Emily, where are you? The guards are down, but Reed's gone. We need to move now." A crackle of static, followed by Sarah's voice, came through the radio, sounding tinny but clear. "We're inside, but there are more guards than we thought. The kids are in the next building, but we're surrounded. We can't get them out without a fight." Jake clenched his jaw. The situation was spiraling faster than he'd expected, but they had no choice now. They had to push through. He stood up, moving cautiously toward the door, keeping low. He needed to find Dr. Reed and get the information. He had on Samir. "I'm coming to you," Jake said. "Stay low, stay quiet. We'll find a way out." As he moved down the hallway, the building seemed eerily quiet. Too quiet. It felt like the calm before the storm. The tension hung thick in the air, and Jake's senses were on high alert. Every footstep sounded too loud, every shadow too ominous. Then he heard it, the faintest creak of a door opening from ahead. He froze, pressing his back to the wall. Someone was coming. His heart hammered in his chest as he strained his ears to listen. Footsteps grew louder, closer. A man's voice echoed down the hall. "I told you we needed to move faster." Dr. Reed's voice was sharp, commanding. "They're here, they know. We can't afford to stay here any longer. Pack up everything. We leave now." Jake's blood ran cold. Reed was still here. He was getting away. Without thinking, Jake rushed forward, his feet making no sound on the cold concrete floor. He rounded the corner and saw Dr. Reed entering a nearby office. The door was ajar, just wide enough for Jake to slip inside. He couldn't afford to waste time. With a deep breath, he kicked the door open, the metal slamming against the wall. Dr. Reed spun around, his face pale, eyes wide with shock. "You again!" Reed sneered, taking a step back. "I thought you were dead." Jake's jaw tightened. "Not today, Reed. Where's Samir?" Dr. Reed's eyes flickered for a brief moment, his gaze darting toward the back of the office, where a door led to a smaller hallway. He was trying to calculate his next move, weighing the options. But Jake wasn't giving him the time. Jake raised his weapon, keeping his hand steady. "Don't make me ask again." Reed smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. He was stalling. "You think you can just walk in here and demand answers? You don't know what you're dealing with. You don't know what we've done." Jake's voice dropped to a growl. "I know enough. Now tell me where Samir is, or I swear to God—" "Samir!" Reed laughed bitterly. "Samir's a dead man. You're too late. We've already completed the procedure. There's no saving him." Jake's blood boiled at the words. "You're lying." Reed's face hardened. "Am I? You really think after all these years you can change the outcome? You think you can just walk away from what you did?" Jake took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Reed's. "I'm not here for the past, Reed. I'm here for the kids. And I'm here for Samir." Before Reed could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway again. Louder this time, closer. A group of guards was coming. Jake didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, knocking Reed to the ground before spinning around to face the door. "Stay down," Jake ordered, his voice low and urgent. Reed tried to struggle, but Jake had already grabbed him by the collar, lifting him off the ground. The door to the hallway burst open, and two more guards entered, weapons raised. Jake's mind moved faster than his body. He didn't have much time. With a swift motion, Jake shoved Reed toward the guards, using him as a shield. Reed screamed in protest as the guards hesitated for a moment, just long enough for Jake to make his move. He took the opportunity and rushed forward, ducking low, his gun raised. He fired once, twice, taking down the closest guard before spinning and diving behind cover. The hallway erupted into chaos as the sound of more guards filled the air. Jake's heart raced. He had to keep moving. There was no time to lose. Samir was waiting. The kids were waiting. And the nightmare was far from over. The gunfire echoed through the cold hallways, sharp and jarring. Jake's pulse was racing, but his mind was calm, focusing only on one thing: survival. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now, not when everything was on the line. He darted behind a metal column, taking cover as bullets sprayed the air. The guards weren't stopping, and Reed was still on the floor, cursing and scrambling for cover. The chances of getting out of this alive were slim. The compound was crawling with soldiers, and reinforcements were already en route. But Jake wasn't about to go down without a fight. From the corner of his eye, he saw Sarah and Emily sprinting down the hallway, their faces set in determination. They had come in after hearing the commotion. Sarah's gun was raised, scanning for targets, while Emily was close behind, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and resolve. "We need to move, Jake," Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "The kids are secured, but they're not safe yet. There are more guards coming." Jake's heart pounded. There wasn't much time. The sounds of approaching footsteps were growing louder, and he could hear the muffled crackle of walkie-talkies. More guards were on their way. He took one last look at Reed, who was now sitting on the ground, clutching his side, an expression of pure hatred on his face. He wasn't dead, not yet, but Jake didn't have time to finish the job. They needed to get out. "Let's go," Jake barked, motioning for Sarah and Emily to lead. The way. The three of them sprinted down the hallway, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. Every corner they turned, they risked encountering another group of guards. They had to be fast. Jake scanned the area ahead. He knew this building. He had spent enough time here in the past to recognize the layout, even in the chaos. He led the group down another corridor, pushing open a heavy steel door that led to the outside. The cold night air hit him immediately, and for the first time since they had entered the compound, Jake allowed himself to breathe. But there was no time to celebrate. The outside wasn't much safer. The entire perimeter was covered in high walls, and the area was patrolled regularly. The moment they stepped into the open, they were exposed. "We need to move fast," Jake said through gritted teeth. "That way." He pointed toward a low, abandoned shed near the fence. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it was their best shot. They ran toward the shed, their footsteps muffled by the tall grass. As they neared the shelter, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of a helicopter approaching. His heart skipped a beat. They were running out of time. "Jake," Sarah called urgently, her eyes wide as she looked up. "Helicopter. It's heading this way." Jake's eyes darted to the sky, where the helicopter was growing larger by the second. It was coming in fast, its headlights sweeping over the ground as it descended toward the compound. They couldn't outrun it. There was no way to escape in time. "We're not going to make it," Emily gasped, panic creeping into her voice. Jake's mind raced. There was one way out. He had to get to the fence. It was their only hope. "Over there," Jake shouted, pointing to the gap in the fence where he had seen earlier. It wasn't much of a hole, but it was their best chance. With no time to waste, the trio sprinted toward the fence. Behind them, the helicopter's blades whirred louder, closer. The spotlight from the chopper cut through the darkness, scanning the ground for any movement. Jake reached the fence first. He could feel the cold metal against his hands as he pushed at the wires. It was tight, but he could squeeze through. He motioned for Sarah and Emily to hurry. "Go, go, go," Jake urged, his voice strained. Emily was next, crawling through the gap with agility, followed by Sarah, who pulled herself through with a grim determination. But just as Jake was about to follow, a loud voice called out from behind them, "Stop!" Right there. Jake froze. He turned, his heart sinking. 3 guards were running toward them, guns raised. The chopper's spotlight was now trained directly on them, illuminating their escape route. Without thinking, Jake shoved his body through the fence, the wires scraping against his skin. He barely made it, but he was through. "Come on!" Jake shouted to Sarah and Emily, urging them to keep moving. They had no time to look back. They ran through the dense forest, the sound of helicopters still overhead, the bright lights flashing across the trees. They pushed forward, hearts pounding in their chests, adrenaline fueling their every step. Behind them, they could hear the distant sounds of footsteps, but they didn't slow down. They kept running. As they neared the edge of the forest, Jake spotted their truck, parked on the other side of a clearing. They were close, so close. Just then, Jake's phone vibrated in his pocket. He fumbled for it, his hands shaking with urgency. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Trask. "Reed's dead. Get out while you can. This whole thing is falling apart." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The mission was falling apart, but they were so close. "Sarah, Emily!" Jake shouted, grabbing their attention as they reached the truck. "We're almost there." But as they reached the vehicle, a sudden explosion rocked the ground beneath them. The force of it knocked them off their feet, sending them sprawling into the dirt. The air was thick with dust and smoke. Jake blinked, his ears ringing, struggling to regain his bearings. Was it a bomb? Was it a trap? Through the haze, he saw the chopper descend lower, its engines roaring as it hovered just above them. "This is it?" Sarah muttered, a grim resolve in her eyes. "We have no choice, we fight." Jake's breath caught in his throat. They weren't going to make it without help, but he couldn't let them be caught. Not after everything they had been through. "Everyone get to the truck," Jake shouted, grabbing their arms and pulling them toward the vehicle. They sprinted, hearts racing, the chopper's light still blinding them from above. Jake hit the gas, the truck roaring to life. It lurched, forward, tires kicking up dirt as they tore out of the clearing, heading into the night, away from the chaos. But they knew it wasn't over. The fight was far from done. This was just the beginning. The truck rattled over the rough terrain, the engine roaring as it sped through the night. Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the darkened road ahead. The glow from the helicopter's spotlight had faded into the distance, but the constant sense of danger hung over them like a dark cloud. Behind him, Sarah and Emily were quiet, the adrenaline of the escape still buzzing in their veins. The chaos of the compound was behind them, but the threat wasn't over. They'd managed to get away, but they were still in enemy territory, and there was no telling how long it would be before someone found them. Jake's mind raced. They needed to get to a safe location, and fast. But even if they found a safe house, there was still the matter of Dr. Reed's message. He'd mentioned something about Samir being dead, but Jake refused to believe it. There had to be a way to save him. "We need to get off the main road," Jake said, his voice steady, despite the chaos swirling in his mind. "We'll find a spot to lay low and figure out what's next." Sarah glanced at him, her eyes sharp in the dim light. "Do you think Reed's telling the truth about Samir?" Jake clenched his jaw, not taking his eyes off the road. "I don't know, but I'm not giving up on him, not after everything we've been through." Emily, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice laced with concern. "What if Reed was right? What if Samir really is gone?" Jake's heart clenched at the thought. The idea of losing Samir after everything they'd fought for was unbearable, but he couldn't afford to let doubt take over. Not now. "We can't think like that," Jake said, his voice firm. "We have to believe there's still a way out of this. We'll figure it out." They continued down the road, the truck bouncing. Over the uneven surface, Jake's thoughts turned to Reed. The man had been with them for years, but now he was a threat, someone they couldn't trust. And the worst part was that Jake didn't know what Reed had planned. The man was dangerous, unpredictable, and he had a hand in all of this. The truck jolted to a stop, pulling Jake out of his thoughts. He quickly put the vehicle in park, his eyes scanning the surroundings. They had reached a small, isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was the perfect place to lay low for a while. But Jake's gut told him it wasn't enough. They needed more than just a safe place. They needed a plan. "We'll rest here for the night," Jake said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But in the morning we move out again. We need to find out what Reed's up to and get to Samir before it's too late." Sarah and Emily nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They didn't have the luxury of time. Every second they spent waiting was another second that someone might be closing in on them. They exited the truck, moving quickly toward the cabin. The place looked abandoned, its windows dark and the door slightly ajar. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Jake motioned for Sarah to check the inside while he kept watch outside. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. Not after everything that had happened. As Sarah entered the cabin, Jake stood by the door, his ears straining for any sound. The forest around them was eerily quiet, the only noise coming from the rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. He kept his hand near his weapon, ready for anything. Inside, Sarah quickly assessed the space. It was a small one-room cabin with a fireplace in the corner and a single bed along the wall. Dust and cobwebs covered the furniture, but it looked secure enough. "We're good," Sarah called out, her voice low but calm. "No sign of anyone," Jake nodded, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. They were safe for now, but the clock was ticking, and they had no idea what Reed's next move would be. The trio settled in for the night, each of them lost in their thoughts. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though there were no signs of immediate danger. His mind kept going back to Samir and the mysterious procedure Reed had been involved in. He couldn't help but wonder what they had done to him, and what kind of monster Samir might become if he wasn't saved in time. "Jake," Emily's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "What's going to happen to Samir?" Jake exhaled slowly, his mind heavy with the weight of the question. He looked over at Emily, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and tired. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not giving up on him. We'll get him back. We just have to be smart and stay ahead of Reed." Sarah sat down beside Emily, her expression unreadable. "Reed is dangerous, Jake. He's not just some scientist. He's part of something much bigger, and I don't think we know the full extent of what we're up against." Jake's chest tightened at her words. He had suspected that Reed was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle, but the more they uncovered, the more he realized how deep the conspiracy ran. "We need to find out more about Reed's network," Jake said, his voice firm with resolve. "If we're going to stop whatever they've planned, we need all the information we can get." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "And what if we can't stop it? What if it's already too late?" Jake met her gaze, his expression hardening. "Then we make sure the rest of it doesn't happen. We fight for every inch. We fight for Samir." The cabin fell silent as they all processed the weight of his words. They had come so far, and there was no turning back now. But Jake knew they couldn't do it alone. They would need allies, resources, and most of all, time. As the night stretched on, the tension between them grew. They were all too aware that the next day would be even harder than the one before. Tomorrow they would find Reed, and tomorrow they would fight for Samir. The first light of dawn broke through the dense trees, casting long shadows across the cabin. Jake woke up with a jolt, the chill of the morning air biting into his skin as he pushed himself out of bed. His mind was already racing, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Every second they waited was another second they could lose Samir. He glanced over at Sarah and Emily, both still asleep. Sarah had curled up on the floor near the small fireplace, wrapped in a thin blanket, while Emily had somehow managed to fall asleep sitting up, her head resting against the cabin wall. Despite the exhaustion written all over their faces, they knew that this couldn't last much longer. They needed to move. Jake grabbed his jacket, careful not to wake them, and stepped outside. The cool morning air was refreshing, but there was a sense of foreboding hanging in the atmosphere, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. He squinted against the rising sun, trying to clear the fog in his mind. His eyes scanned the surroundings, looking for any signs of danger. It was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. Jake felt that prickling sense of being watched again, but there was no movement in the trees, no rustle in the bushes. He let out a breath and shook his head. He had to stop being paranoid, but the events of the last few days had left him on edge. Turning back to the cabin, he was about to step inside when he heard a noise. It was faint at first, just the sound of something snapping in the distance, but it was enough to make Jake freeze in place. His hand instinctively reached for the gun holstered at his side. His heart rate picked up as he cautiously moved toward the sound. There was no way he was going to let his guard down now, not when they were so close to finding out what Reed was up to. The sound came again, clearer this time, a soft footstep, then another. Jake's eyes darted toward the tree line. He didn't see anything, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't alone. Moving silently, Jake crept closer to the edge of the trees, his senses on high alert. He wanted to be sure before he made a move, but he couldn't afford to be reckless. One wrong move, and it could be the end for all of them. Then he saw it. A figure, a man, crouched low against a tree, peering through binoculars. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a random hiker or passerby. This was someone who had been watching them, someone who knew exactly who they were. Jake quickly pulled back behind the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to warn Sarah and Emily. He couldn't let them be caught off guard. Inside, he found Sarah awake and already preparing their things. She looked up as he entered, her sharp eyes instantly noticing the tension in his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low and steady, as if she already knew something was wrong. "We're not alone," Jake said, keeping his voice calm. "There's someone out there, a man. He's been watching us." Sarah's face hardened. She nodded. "How many?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. "Just the one so far, but we can't be sure. We need to move." He turned to Emily, who was still rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Time to go," he said gently. "Get up, we need to move fast." Emily didn't need any further explanation. She quickly gathered her things, her eyes wide with nervous energy. They had barely packed when the sound of a crackling radio pierced the air, followed by a voice distorted but urgent. "Subject has been located. Proceed with caution. No sign of the others yet. Over." Jake's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, but it was clear enough to recognize. It was one of Reed's men. They had found them. The hunters had become the hunted. "Move!" Jake snapped, already moving toward the door. The quiet forest had suddenly become a ticking time bomb. They rushed out of the cabin and into the woods. trying to stay low, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. Jake led the way, his mind calculating every possible escape route. The man he had seen earlier was likely part of a larger search team. They had to act fast or they would be caught. Sarah, who was always calm under pressure, glanced at Jake as they ran. "Where are we going?" Jake didn't hesitate. "We'll head north. There's a small village up there. If we can make it, we can lay low and figure out our next move." Emily, breathless from the sprint, glanced over at him. "And Samir?" Jake's heart twisted at the mention of his name. "We're getting to him, I promise." The forest around them seemed to close in as they pushed forward, the trees growing thicker and the terrain more rugged. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the woods, each twig snapping underfoot making Jake flinch. They were getting closer to their destination, but every second felt like an eternity. Then, just as they were nearing a clearing, a shout rang out from behind them. "There they are! Go, go, go!" Jake's heart raced as he turned to see figures emerging from the trees. Reed's men were closing in. They were trapped. "Get down!" Jake shouted, pulling Sarah and Emily into the cover of some nearby rocks. He motioned for them to stay low, his mind working furiously. They had no choice now but to fight their way through. One of Reed's men appeared in the clearing, his gun raised, scanning for movement. Jake didn't hesitate. He was already on the move, a plan forming in his mind. He had to take the first. Man down quickly, then grab the gun before they could call for backup. In a flash, Jake darted from behind the rock, his body moving instinctively as he tackled the soldier to the ground. The two of them wrestled for control of the gun, but Jake's training kicked in. He twisted the man's wrist, forcing the gun from his grip, and delivered a swift blow to his neck, knocking him unconscious. "Sarah! Emily!" Jake shouted, his voice urgent. "Go!" Sarah and Emily didn't need to be told twice. They bolted from their hiding spot, running toward the trees with Jake close behind. "Keep moving! We're almost there!" Jake yelled, adrenaline flooding his system. But as they neared the edge of the forest, another shout echoed from behind them. The chase wasn't over. They had to keep running. The forest around them felt like a maze. The trees, thick and oppressive, seemed to close in as they ran, the sound of their feet pounding the earth blending with the distant calls of Reed's men. Jake's breath was ragged, his pulse hammering in his ears, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Not now, not when they were so close to the edge of this nightmare. The small village Jake had mentioned wasn't far, just a few miles north, but in their current state, it felt like an eternity away. Every footstep they took was one closer to being caught, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded towards something worse. The sound of branches snapping, heavy boots crashing through the undergrowth, made it clear that Reed's men were gaining ground. They were on the hunt. "Faster!" Jake urged, his voice sharp. "We can't let them catch us." Sarah and Emily, though exhausted and running on adrenaline, kept pace. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, kept her eyes trained on the path ahead, while Emily's wide eyes kept darting back, the fear of being caught too real in her chest. "Jake." Emily gasped, her voice strained. "What now?" Jake didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. There had to be a way out. They couldn't keep running forever, not with Reed's men closing in on them. He needed a plan. And he needed it now ahead. The trees thinned slightly. The clearing Jake had seen in his mind's eye was just up ahead. The village should be close, just beyond the tree line. They could make it, but only if they were fast enough. "I see it," Sarah called out, pointing toward the break in the trees. A surge of hope shot through Jake's chest. But it was short-lived. "Stop!" a voice shouted from behind them. A shout of authority, commanding and cold. The sound was unmistakable. Reed's men were here. Jake spun around, barely having time to react before a figure emerged from the tree line, aiming his rifle straight at them. Jake's instincts kicked in, and in a blur of motion, he pushed Sarah and Emily down behind a large boulder. The sound of a bullet whizzing past him was deafening, followed by a second shot that hit the ground with a thud. "Stay down!" Jake barked, his heart racing. The shot had been too close. They couldn't keep running from this. Jake had to act. He pulled his gun from its holster, his eyes darting over the landscape for a clear shot. He saw another figure moving up to flank them, a man circling around the boulder. Jake took a deep breath and waited. His muscles tensed as he calculated the exact moment to strike. Without a second thought, he sprang up from his hiding spot, firing in one fluid motion. The man was taken down in a heartbeat, collapsing in the dirt. But there was no time to savor the victory. Jake quickly turned back toward the others, urgency in his eyes. "Go," he ordered. "Now, keep moving. They'll be here any second." Sarah and Emily didn't hesitate. They scrambled to their feet, their faces grim but determined, and dashed forward toward the clearing. Jake followed close behind, his senses on high alert. He could hear the sound of more men approaching, the crunch of leaves and twigs signaling that they weren't alone. As they reached the edge of the trees, Jake saw the village in the distance. It was a small settlement, a handful of houses clustered together at the foot of a steep hill. The village looked abandoned, its buildings crumbling and overgrown with vines, but it was their best shot at safety. They sprinted toward the village, their pace quickening as they neared the small, dilapidated houses. But just as they thought, they were in the clear. Another voice called out behind them. "You won't make it." The voice was cold, taunting. "You're trapped." Jake turned to see a new figure, tall and imposing, stepping out from the shadows. The man was dressed in military gear, a scar running down his cheek and a gun held loosely in his hands. He was no ordinary soldier. This was someone who had been tracking them for a long time. "It's over," the man continued, his voice a gravelly sneer. "You can't run forever." Jake's pulse quickened, but he didn't stop. The village was only a few yards away. If they could make it inside one of those houses, they might have a chance to regroup. They could hold out at least until nightfall. "We're not done yet," Jake growled, his voice full of resolve. "Not by a long shot." In a single fluid motion, Jake fired his gun, sending the bullet whizzing past the man's ear. It wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to disarm. The soldier jerked back in surprise, and for a split second he hesitated. That was all the opening Jake needed. "Run!" Jake shouted as he turned to sprint toward the nearest house. Sarah and Emily were right behind him, their footsteps heavy with fear and exhaustion. The man's voice echoed behind them. "You think you can outrun me? You're nothing but prey." Jake ignored him, focusing solely on the house ahead. They had to make it inside. Just a few more steps. They burst through the broken door of the first house, slamming it behind them. The inside was dark and musty, the air stale with the scent of mildew and decay, but it was better than being out in the open. Jake quickly moved to a window, pulling the tattered curtains aside and peering out. There was no sign of their pursuers. "Yet, we need a plan," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Jake nodded, his mind already working overtime. "We can't stay here long. They'll be looking for us, and we're not equipped to fight them off in this place. We need to move again, and we need to figure out what Reed is really up to." Emily, still panting from the run, looked at Jake with wide, terrified eyes. "What if they catch us? What if we can't stop them?" Jake met her gaze, his face hard, with determination. "We'll stop them, we have to. For Samir, for all of us." As the three of them huddled in the dark, the reality of the situation set in. They were in the heart of enemy territory now. They didn't know how far Reed's reach extended or what his ultimate plan was. But Jake knew one thing for certain. They were in a fight for their lives, and there was no going back. The silence inside the abandoned house was deafening, broken only by the sound of their labored breaths. Jake stood by the window, scanning the desolate landscape outside. His eyes narrowed as he tried to make sense of their situation. He wasn't sure how long they had until Reed's men realized where they had gone, but the ticking clock in his head was growing louder. "We can't stay here," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She was seated at the dusty table, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the wood. "This place is too exposed." Jake nodded, glancing over his shoulder at her. He could see the strain in her eyes, the same tension that had been building inside him ever since. They'd made their break from the woods. They were running out of time, and they needed more answers about Reed, answers they still didn't have. "I know," Jake replied, his tone grim, "but right now it's the safest option we have. If we move out into the open, we'll be sitting ducks. We need to figure out what Reed's after and why he's sending people after us. We need to find out what his plan is," Sarah said, her mind already shifting to strategy. If we can figure that out, we might have a chance to stop him. Jake felt a flash of frustration. But how? We don't know enough about him, and we sure as hell don't know where Samir is right now. Emily, who had been sitting in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, looked up at them. We don't have to figure it all out ourselves, she said quietly. We need to get to someone who does. Jake turned to her, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? Emily hesitated, then spoke more firmly. I know someone who worked with Reed, a former colleague. If anyone knows what he's planning, it's her. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Jake felt a spark of hope flicker inside him. Could Emily be right? Could there be someone out there who had the answers they needed? Who is she? Sarah asked, her voice full of urgency. Where is she? Emily's eyes flickered to the floor as she took a deep breath. Her name is Lauren. She used to be part of Reed's inner circle before she disappeared. I haven't seen her in years, but if she's still alive, she could be the key to stopping Reed. Jake felt his pulse quicken. Do you know where she is? Emily shook her head, her face full of regret. I don't, but I know how we can find her. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. How? Emily's voice dropped to a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Lauren had a contact, someone she trusted. If we can track down that person, we might be able to find Lauren. She'll know what Reed's up to, and she might be able to help us get Samir back. Jake weighed the idea carefully. It was a long shot, but it was their best option. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded in agreement. It's better than sitting here waiting to be found, Jake said. We'll take the risk, but we have to move fast. If Reed finds us before we get to Lauren, we're done for. Emily nodded eagerly. I know a place where the contact might be. It's a small town about 20 miles from here. We can head there, find out what we need, and get back before Reed's men close in. Then let's move, Jake said, his voice firm. We don't have any time to waste. They quickly gathered their things, each of them trying to maintain their composure despite the overwhelming fear that gnawed at their insides. There was no telling what they would find when they reached the small town, but it was their best chance. They had to take it. As they stepped out of the crumbling house and into the cold early morning air, Jake felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. They were stepping into enemy territory, and there was no turning back. But there was a glimmer of hope now, a thread of possibility that they could use to pull themselves out of the darkness. The small town that Emily had mentioned was just over the horizon, its outline faint against the rising sun. It seemed so peaceful from a distance, but Jake knew better. There were dangers everywhere, and if Reed's men were as close as they suspected, they couldn't afford to make a mistake. They set off through the woods once again, their footsteps soft against the earth. The landscape was familiar, the same dense trees and thick underbrush that they had been navigating for days. But this time, the weight of their mission was heavier, the stakes higher. They couldn't afford to get caught. As they walked, Emily spoke in low tones, giving them the last details about Lauren's contact. It was a man named Tom, someone who had been involved in the same circles as Reed and Lauren years ago. Emily hadn't heard from him in a long time, but if anyone could lead them to Lauren, it would be him. Tom's not the type to trust easily, Emily warned. He's been burned by Reed before, so he might not be willing to help us. But we have to try. Jake nodded. We'll convince him. The sun was higher in the sky now, the light filtering through the trees in dappled patterns. They reached the edge of the woods and saw the road ahead, a narrow dirt path that would lead them to the town. But just as they reached it, a familiar sound reached their ears, footsteps fast and heavy crunching on the gravel behind them. Jake whirled around, his heart skipping a beat. There was no time to react, no time to hide. They were too exposed. Run, he shouted, his voice harsh with urgency. Without thinking, they sprinted down the path, their legs pumping, adrenaline surging through their bodies. The sound of pursuit grew louder, but Jake didn't dare look back. They had no choice but to keep moving. The town was close now, just beyond the next bend, but they had to make it there before they were caught. The enemy was closing in, and every second counted. The small town loomed ahead, its silhouette visible just beyond the bend in the road. The closer they got, the more Jake could feel the tension in the air. His legs burned from the sprint, but he didn't dare slow down. Not now. not with Reed's men closing in on them. The narrow dirt path they were on soon gave way to cobblestone. Streets and the distant sound of the town's activity could be heard in the background. There were shops, houses, and the low hum of people going about their day, seemingly unaware of the danger creeping just outside their walls. "Keep moving!" Jake barked, his voice sharp and commanding, as he glanced over his shoulder. The footsteps. Behind them were still there, faint but growing louder. They were almost within range. Sarah and Emily were right behind him, their breaths coming in gasps. It was clear that they were exhausted, but their resolve hadn't wavered. They had come too far to be caught now. The town looked deserted, its buildings quiet and weathered, as if time had passed them by. But Jake knew better than to assume that no one was watching. The enemy could be anywhere, blending in with the crowd waiting for their chance to strike. They reached the edge of the town, a small square with a rusted fountain at the center. There were a few people milling about, but their attention was elsewhere, lost in their own routines. It was the perfect place to hide, at least for a few moments. "We need to find Tom," Emily whispered, her voice full of urgency. "Before they catch up." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the square. "Do you know where he is?" Emily's gaze darted around the area, searching the faces in the crowd. "There's a tavern up ahead. He used to hang out there a lot. If he's here, that's where he'll be." "Let's go," Jake said, his tone firm. "Stay low. Keep your heads down. We don't know who might be watching." They moved quickly through the square, staying close to the buildings and out of sight. The tavern wasn't far, just a few doors down from the fountain. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty streets, their urgency palpable as they approached the dimly lit building. As they reached the door, Emily paused, her hand hovering just above the handle. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Tom's not someone you can trust easily." Jake turned to her, his expression hard. "We don't have a choice. He's the only lead we've got." With a determined nod, Emily pushed the door open and they stepped inside. The tavern was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and smoke. The floor was uneven, the old wooden boards creaking beneath their feet as they walked. In the room was nearly empty, save for a few patrons sitting at the bar, their heads down as they nursed their drinks. At the far end of the room, a man sat alone at a table, his back to the wall. Jake's instincts flared. The man had the air of someone who didn't want to be seen. He was tall, with dark, messy hair and a jacket that looked like it had seen better days. But what caught Jake's attention was the way the man held himself. His posture was stiff, his eyes darting around the room as if he was always on alert. "That's him," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tom," Jake nodded. "Let's get this over with." They walked toward the man, and as they neared the table, he looked up, his eyes narrowing as he assessed them. His gaze flickered briefly to Emily, then settled on Jake. "I thought I recognized you," Tom said, his voice rough and grating like he hadn't spoken in days. "What the hell are you doing here, Emily?" "Looking for answers," Emily replied, her voice steady. "We need your help." Tom's gaze flickered between them, his expression hardening. "I don't get involved in this mess anymore. Reed's people are everywhere. You're better off running while you can." Jake stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "We don't have time for games. We need to find Lauren, and we need to know what Reed's planning. You're the only one who can help us." Tom leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Lauren's gone. If you think I'm going to stick my neck out for you, you're wrong. Reed's got eyes everywhere. Helping you would get me killed. Not if you help us." "Stop him," Jake said, his voice intense. "We're already in this deep, Tom. We don't have a choice." For a long moment, Tom stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll help you, but we need to move fast. There's a lot you don't know about Reed. If you want to take him down, you're going to need more than just a plan. You'll need firepower, and you'll need allies." "Who can we trust?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. Tom's lips twitched, a cynical smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's the tricky part. You can't trust anyone around here, not if they've got ties to Reed, but I know a place. A safe house. If we can get there, we can figure out what to do next." Jake didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." Tom stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. "Follow me, and keep your heads down. We're not the only ones looking for answers." As they stepped back into the street, the weight of what they were about to do hung heavily over them. They were no longer just running from Reed's men. They were about to enter the heart of his operations. The danger was greater than ever, but Jake knew they had no choice but to push forward. The path ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. The crossroads they had reached would determine the course of everything. They had one shot at stopping Reed, and it was up to them to make it count. The wind had picked up by the time they left the tavern, the gusts sending leaves swirling through the narrow alleyways and sending a chill through the air. Tom led the way, moving quickly and purposefully through the streets, his body language tense, as if he knew that danger was just around every corner. Jake, Sarah, and Emily followed close behind, each of them scanning the shadows, keeping alert for any sign of trouble. The town felt different now. It wasn't just the people, it was the air, thick with a sense of dread. The simple, quiet place they had entered hours ago now felt like a trap. Every step they took was a risk, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Where's this safe house?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she kept pace with Jake. Tom didn't look back, but his voice was steady. "It's on the outskirts, a cabin in the woods. No one goes there unless they need to. That's why it's safe." "Safe from who?" Emily asked, her eyes darting nervously around. Tom glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "From everyone." They moved quickly, keeping to the back alleys, avoiding the main roads. The last thing they needed was to draw attention. As they neared the edge of town, Jake's thoughts raced. They were getting closer to finding out what Reed was truly after, but the danger was growing with every step. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for answers. Tom led them through a dense cluster of trees that bordered the town, and the path grew steeper as they climbed. The woods felt different than the ones they had crossed earlier, darker, more oppressive. The faint sound of distant footsteps echoed in the air, a reminder that they weren't as alone as they wanted to be. "Stay close," Tom muttered, glancing over his shoulder again. "We're almost there." It felt like an eternity before they finally reached the cabin. It was a small, weathered structure, tucked away in the trees like it had been forgotten by time. The walls were covered in ivy, and the roof sagged slightly, but it was sturdy enough. Tom approached the door cautiously, checking both ways before pulling out a key from his jacket pocket and unlocking it. The inside was just as simple as the outside. The walls were bare, save for a few old photographs and maps pinned to the wooden beams. A small fireplace crackled in the corner, its warmth a welcome relief from the cold, but the place still felt empty, haunted, almost. "Sit down," Tom said, gesturing to the small table in the center of the room. "We've got work to do." The four of them settled around the table, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them. Tom poured them each a cup of water, then took a seat at the head of the table. "We don't have much time," Tom said, his voice low. "Reed has a plan, a big one, and it's not just about you, Jake, or Emily. It's about something much bigger." Jake leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Tom. "What's he planning?" Tom's expression darkened. "It's hard to explain, but I'll try. Reed's been after something for years. It's not just power. He wants control. Full control. He's been gathering resources, people, information, the stuff you two stumbled onto. That's only a small part of it." Sarah frowned. "What does that have to do with us?" "Everything," Tom replied. "Reed's not interested in just overthrowing governments or taking over businesses. He's planning something more, something that could change the course of history. If he succeeds, no one will be able to stop him." Emily's eyes widened. "What are you talking about? What's he planning?" Tom sighed, rubbing his face. "He's building an army, but not just any army. It's a group of people with unique abilities, people who can do things that normal humans can't. And Reed's been experimenting on them for years, testing their limits, trying to harness their powers." Jake's mind raced. "You're saying he's making superhumans?" Tom nodded grimly. "Not exactly, but close enough. These people, these experiments, are being trained to follow Reed's orders without question. They don't have a choice, and Reed plans to use them to take control of the world. That's insane, Sarah muttered, shaking her head. Tell me about it, Tom said, his voice grim. But it's real, and it's happening right now. Jake stood up, pacing the room as he processed the information. It didn't make sense. How could Reed be behind something so monstrous, so far-reaching? And yet, everything Tom was saying fit with what they had already seen. What do we do? Jake asked, his voice tight with urgency. How do we stop him? Tom paused, his face serious. You need to find the source, the heart of the operation. Once you cut that out, everything else falls apart. But getting there won't be easy. Reed has people everywhere, loyalists who will do anything to protect him. Jake's mind raced. Where is it? Where do we start? Tom didn't answer immediately. He pulled a map from a drawer and spread it out on the table. It was marked with red X's, pinpointing several locations, some familiar, some new. This is where Reed's been hiding his operations, Tom said, tapping the map. The heart of his project is at this facility here, deep in the mountains. It's heavily guarded, and no one gets in without being noticed. Emily's eyes followed the lines of the map. We can't just walk in there, it's suicide. Jake's gaze never left the map. Then we find another way in. We have to. Tom leaned back in his chair. You're going to need help. I can't go with you, not with Reed's men hunting me down. But I can give you the information you need. You'll need to get in, disable the security, and stop whatever it is Reed's doing before it's too late. There was a long silence as the weight of the mission settled over them. We don't have much time, Jake said, breaking the silence. If we're going to stop Reed, we need to move now. Tom stood, pulling a small metal box from a shelf. This should help. It's a communication device. One of the few things Reed's men won't be able to trace. It'll help you stay in contact with the outside world. Jake took the device, feeling its weight in his hands. Thanks. Tom's eyes flickered, with something like regret. You'll need all the help you can get. As they prepared to leave the cabin, the air felt heavier than before. Jake knew they were about to face their biggest challenge yet. They had a location, a plan, and just enough hope to keep them moving forward. But there was no denying it. Reed wasn't going to let them stop him without a fight. As they stepped back into the woods, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a storm that was far bigger than they had ever imagined. The sky was darkening as they made their way through the thick forest, the trees casting long shadows across the narrow trail. The air was heavy with tension, each step forward feeling like a step closer to the unknown. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he led the way, the weight of the mission pressing down on him. They had come too far to turn back now. Tom's map had led them this far, to the foothills of the mountain range where Reed's secret facility was located, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. They had to move quietly, strategically. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. We're getting close, Jake muttered, glancing over his shoulder at Emily, Sarah, and Tom. Keep your eyes open. Emily was gripping her rifle tightly, her knuckles white. This is it, isn't it? We're not turning back now. No turning back, Jake replied, his voice steady but laced with a hint of tension. This ends tonight. Tom had been silent for the last few miles, his face a mask of concentration as he checked the map again. His eyes flickered with concern as he looked up. You know this is going to be the hardest part, right? Getting in undetected, taking down the guards. It's not going to be easy. We're ready, Sarah said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. We've come this far, we're not backing down now. Tom nodded, though there was a somber look in his eyes. Just make sure you're prepared for anything. Reed doesn't play by the rules, and neither do his people. They pressed on, their pace quickening as they neared the facility. The trees began to thin, giving way to rocky terrain. In the distance, the facility's outline emerged, a massive structure built into the side of the mountain. It looked imposing, fortified, and almost indestructible. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their figures silhouetted against the faint light of the setting sun. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was it. They were moments away from launching an assault on one of Reed's most secure locations. The odds were stacked against them, but there was no turning back now. Tom stopped and motioned for them to gather around. Here's the plan. There's an entrance on the east side near the back. It's heavily guarded, but there's a blind spot in the patrols. We'll slip past it, disable the security systems, and infiltrate the building. Once inside, we split up. Emily and Sarah, you'll take the lower levels. Jake and I will go for the control room. Jake nodded, the adrenaline kicking in. What about Reed? We'll find him, Tom said grimly. But we have to take down the facility first. If we don't disable his operations, it won't matter. They set off toward the facility, moving swiftly through the trees. The closer they got, the more Jake's senses heightened. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the stillness of the mountain night. They crouched low, staying out of sight as they approached the edge of the building. Tom signaled for them to stop. Ahead of them, the faint light of a guard tower loomed, its silhouette casting a long shadow across the ground. Jake could see two guards standing watch, their backs turned. It was their chance. Now, Tom whispered. They moved like shadows, silent and swift. Jake's heart raced as they slipped past the guards, making their way toward the blind spot Tom had mentioned. His pulse hammered in his ears, but he kept his focus. This was their only shot. They reached the door without being detected, and Tom quickly disabled the security system with the small device he had given them earlier. A low beep echoed through the night as the door unlocked, and they slipped inside. The facility was cold, sterile, and eerily quiet. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they made their way down the corridor. Jake's footsteps were muffled by the thick concrete floors, but his senses were alert, every step filled with anticipation. They were deep inside enemy territory. Now, Emily and Sarah took the lower levels as planned, while Jake and Tom moved toward the control room. As they rounded a corner, Jake's heart skipped a beat. Ahead of them, a door stood open, and through the glass window, he could see figures. Inside, there were computers, monitors, and a few people working at a desk, their attention focused on the screens in front of them. Tom motioned for Jake to stay low, and they crept toward the door. The faint sound of their breathing filled the silence, and Jake's thoughts raced. They were close, so close. They reached the door, and Tom slowly pushed it open, careful not to make a sound. The control room was small, with only a few people inside, but the real danger lay in what they were monitoring. "Get the system offline," Tom hissed, his voice barely audible. Jake moved toward the nearest terminal and began typing quickly, hacking into the system with the skills he had acquired over the years. The screens flickered as he bypassed security measures, each keystroke bringing them one step closer to shutting down Reed's operation. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the lower levels, followed by the sound of shouting and gunfire. "Damn it," Tom muttered. "They've found us." Jake's heart raced. The battle had begun, and they were running out of time. But they couldn't back down now. He typed faster, his hands moving with precision. The screens flickered again, and then with a sharp beep, the entire system went offline. The lights above them flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. "That's it," Jake said, his voice tense. "The facility's down." But their victory was short-lived. The sound of boots pounding down the corridor grew louder, and the door to the control room slammed open. Reed's men were here. Tom reached for his gun, his eyes locked on the door. "Get ready, it's now or never." The door swung open, and Reed's men flooded into the room, weapons drawn. Jake's heart pounded as he reached for his own weapon, but just as he did, the door to the facility's main room exploded inward, sending a shockwave through the building. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the fire and smoke, was Reed himself. "Did you really think you could stop me?" Reed's voice was cold, filled with malice. "You've made it this far, but this is where it ends." Jake's grip tightened on his weapon as he prepared for the final confrontation. The storm they had been walking into was here, and there was no turning back. This was the end of the line. The final showdown had begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?